Hello, my name is Alejandra Martinez, and I'll be presenting about the coronavirus in Mexico. First of all, some background about the virus. The first cases were reported to the World Health Organization back in December 31st of 2019, according to the position of the College of Internal Medicine of Mexico. And my thesis is that due to the geographical and economic relations to the US and the world, mistrust in the Mexican government, and lack of health and economic infrastructure, Mexico will display a form of modern colonialism where the most vulnerable and marginalized populations, so the poor, indigenous, rural, and slums inhabitants of Mexico and Latin America, are at greater risk or disadvantage in regards to the coronavirus pandemic as compared with the US and Northern European countries. And some social determinants to consider. First of all, this is a picture of a subway in Mexico City that I thought was very interesting because we can see that there's no social distancing and some people are wearing the mask incorrectly. And so just looking at the economy, the Mexican economy is already not doing great, and a 6.5% regression is expected in 2020, according to economists at Moody's Analytics in LA Times. And so that plus having half of the population in Mexico be in poverty is putting Mexicans at a greater risk, as well as having 60% of these people in Mexico, of the population, being part of the informal economy. So informal markets like we saw in our readings about Managua in Nicaragua and Every Day We Live is the Future by Douglas Haynes. And so it just reminded me of that a lot because all these people that are 60% of a population is very significant, and if there's any sort of quarantine, which there has been, it's putting a lot of people out of jobs and explains why many people still are working out and about. And it is also important to look at the rapid urbanization, which we also looked at it in Every Day We Live is in the Future, and the lack of infrastructure in healthcare, not having healthcare sustainability, and also the lack of infrastructure in just roads and lack of water. Accessibility to water is an issue, especially clean water in slums in big cities such as Mexico City, which has the highest numbers of cases in Mexico. The second place to have high rates of COVID-19 deaths is in Baja California, which is in the border to the US. So we can also look at the relationship of the US and Mexico geographically, because those two countries are touching, and there's a border that is not always very clear because there's people that work in the US but live in Mexico. And so there's just been some protests about maquiladoras, which are industrialized workers that have been having pressure to keep on working despite the low environment securities that they have in place for COVID-19. And so it's just very interesting how certain people have the privilege to stop working or work from home like I do, but others don't. And also one thing that I thought was very interesting is that government corruption and history in Mexico of corruption and tyranny, as we have learned about the PRI's long dictatorship, so to say. And now with AMLO, there's just been a lot of desconfianza, which means mistrust in the government and whatever the government says. And there's a belief that was found on Sobre la desconfianza en la ciencia y la política, El brote del Zika en Mexico, 2019. And this article looked at the Zika sprout, and also looked at how many people didn't believe it was real in Mexico, and some people just didn't trust that the government was giving accurate information, or thought that they were giving these news coverage not because they wanted to create awareness, but because the government was going to do some other more important social change or political change that they were trying to mask with the Zika. And this is something that I could relate to because I've felt this way before as well. And I know my family members thought this about the coronavirus and asked me about it. Thankfully, they understand that it is real and that it's important to take precautions. But it was just very important to analyze the political determinants. And we also can look at slow violence. So this is a picture of Baja California, which I've talked about already. And slow violence, according to Bob Nixon, from the Douglas Haynes book, he explained how climate change is more visible in different places, such as the equator or Latin America. And he talked about the global north and global south, which is also talked about in a different article I read that used information about some characteristics about the cholera and norovirus that have happened before in Latin America. They looked at it to kind of give some insight on the COVID-19, and they found that over 80% of kids were infected by at least one strain of norovirus during their first year of life in places in Latin America that are slums with poor sanitation and water access. So this can also help explain why coronavirus cases are seen in places such as Mexico City mostly. Lastly, they also talked about the distrust of government and just what we have talked about. So a takeaway is that according to the Miller et al. Article, and I quote, "The imperative to flatten the curve is even greater for Latin American and the Caribbean than Western European and the United States," end quote. So basically what this means is that the coronavirus is not going to affect the Latin America and the Caribbean as similarly as it will affect or has affected the US and other Northern Hemisphere countries. And so it is just important to be aware of the different determinants of health in Mexico as compared to the US and other countries. And we can analyze how geographical location, historical context, and social determinants play a role in the outcome of this pandemic in Mexico. And here's my references and sources. Thank you.